Tom Schwandt, professor, educational psychology, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Now, I could go on and recite many plaudits about Tom, but you can read that in the in our booklet of the conference. But did you know what a high school career this guy must have had, right? Now listen to the variation here. Not only did he win the science fair, an amazing accomplishment, but concomitantly, he was a sports writer for the Tinley Park Times. I mean, this is really an amazing kind of piece here. Talk about the balance of theory and practice. This is quite a balance that Tom pulled off. But perhaps he and wife Sherry, perhaps their most joyful experience is the two twin lad grandsons that are approaching their third-month birthday, William Christopher and Benjamin Charles. So it's my deep pleasure on many levels to introduce Tom to you. He will be our first speaker in the Eleanor Chelimsky Forum.
The theory-practice distinction is part of a family of oppositions that includes these: pure and applied, abstract and specific, knowledge and behavior, as well as general and particular. And the controversial relationship between these pairs of ideas is hardly unique to evaluation. You could find similar concerns about this pair of oppositions in virtually every field of professional practice, including social work, the ministry, nursing, law, clinical medicine, and education. Moreover, the relationship between knowing and acting is a problem that has attracted the attention of philosophers for centuries, dating at least to Aristotle in the 4th century BC and moving forward a few centuries to the 15th century Chinese philosopher Wang Ying-mang, who is most known for his theory of the unity of knowledge and action. Those of you who aren't particularly good at Neo-Confucius philosophy, me either, might be more familiar with how John Dewey treated the matter of knowing and doing. And I only mention this philosophical legacy briefly here this morning because, in my judgment, much of the current writing and thinking about the relationship of theoretical knowledge to practice in evaluation, as well as in some other fields, seems to be largely unaware of this debate in the theory of knowledge and its relevance for understanding the practical problem of how do we relate thinking and doing. But today I want to do something different. I want to talk about 4 issues. First, what's a practical problem? Secondly, what is practice? Third, what is theory? And fourth, how does theory relate to practice? And I'll close by illustrating how the theory and practice are linked in my own work on the study of the use of evaluation. So first, what's a practical problem? Professional practitioners of all kinds, that includes those of us who are evaluators and managers and financial planners and counselors and social workers and educators and many others, face practical problems. Practical problems are those that demand an action. A practical problem has the general form: what should I do now in this situation, facing these people in this set of circumstances? Taking action in a thoughtful way and wise way, in turn, requires reasoned reflection to decide what one is to do. Practical problem solving demands critical judgment for doing a particular kind of action. Here are some examples. An evaluation of a substance abuse prevention program in middle schools revealed no statistically significant effects of the intervention. But yet the evaluation produced a set of sensible recommendations for improving the program. When the evaluation team shared those results with the executive director of the program, the director became extremely agitated and said, "I hired you so we could get some good PR." He didn't implement the recommendations. What's the practical problem here? The practical problem is, what should the evaluation team do now? Should it attempt to make a second, stronger argument for adopting the recommendations? Should it try to explain that the purpose of evaluation is to offer critical appraisal, not generate good PR? Should the team walk away from this to work another day? You've been invited to submit a proposal for a multi-site evaluation of the impact of upgrading hydroelectric plants in rural areas. Evaluation dollars are limited, travel conditions are difficult, the timeline is almost unreasonable. But there are significant expenditures at stake depending on the results of the evaluation. The practical problem: should you take on this evaluation? And if so, how should you plan it? It's important to distinguish these kinds of professional practice problems that demand an action from something like a general dilemma or a curious situation for which we seek an explanation. Here are some examples. Why did the Bush administration suppress evaluative evidence from the CDC studies revealing health disparities for minority populations in the U.S.? Why was an expensive, large-scale evaluation comparing the effects of alternative treatments for individuals with severe drug and alcohol problems ignored when the evaluation clearly showed that one alternative was superior to the others? Why, in the face of faculty resistance, did an administration of a higher education institution scrap its efforts to implement the ideas of total quality management, even though there was considerable evidence indicating that if these techniques were implemented, work processes would be more efficient, effective, and result in greater student satisfaction? None of these are practical problems. They are problems that require an explanation. To be sure, there may be practical problems involved with these circumstances. For example, if the evaluation team that conducted the large-scale study of alternative treatments asks, what should we do now, given that our evaluation was ignored? And of course, knowing why evaluation was ignored could inform their decision about what to do. But the problem of knowing why something happened and the problem of doing something are two different kinds of problems, and they demand two different kinds of knowledge. Several years ago, Donald Schwandt indicated that the idea that dominates most thinking about knowledge for the professions is that practice is the site where theoretical knowledge is applied to solutions to practical problems. And we see this all the time in the pages of the American Journal of Evaluation. I can't censor what's in my journal, I can only accept it. This is a very bad idea. The professional practice of evaluation, thus, would be regarded as the application of the science of evaluation, its concepts, its models, its approaches, its tools, its procedures, the application of that science in much the same way that engineering is the application of engineering science, thermodynamics, electromagnetics, heat transfer, solid fluid mechanics, etc. But Schwandt's studies of practitioners challenged this way of thinking, and he argued that the problems faced in practice are indeterminate and untidy and not well formed, and therefore they're not suitable for the application of theoretical knowledge. Schwandt argued that practitioners develop solutions to problems of practice from reflecting in action, and that the knowledge inherent in practice is to be understood as artful doing. He wrote, "Practitioners allow themselves to experience surprise, puzzlement, or confusion in a situation in which they find uncertain or unique. They reflect on the phenomenon before them and on the prior understandings they have been implicit in their behavior up to date. They carry out an experiment that serves to generate both new understanding of the problem in front of them and a change in the situation." Let's talk about theory. Professionals, as Schwandt just said, experiment and try out ideas as possible solutions to practical problems that they face. They think things through for every case. So for the example, the evaluation team I mentioned earlier might weigh up the costs and benefits to its reputation if it decides to press the case to the executive director that results suggesting ways to improve the substance abuse program should be used. An evaluator may decide to submit a proposal to evaluate the upgrading of the hydroelectric plants because she's confident that she can assemble a team that can act quickly yet responsibly in gathering the data and transforming those data into evidence for claims about impact, despite the constraints of time and budget. These kinds of practice decisions about what to do can be enlightened with theory. But when we use the term theory, we need to be clear about what we think it means. We are accustomed to thinking of theory as scientific theory, an empirically well-confirmed explanation consistent with the application of scientific criteria recognized within a particular community of scientists. But that's too strict a definition for our purposes. When we use the term theory in evaluation, we could be talking about any of various bodies of knowledge that we typically think of as conceptual or theoretical in some way, and that serve as an aid in thinking through options in a case that a particular practitioner faces. Think of these bodies of knowledge as repertoires of concepts, insights, explanations, and tools that are used as heuristics, tools to think with. They are aids to the evaluation imagination as practitioners come to understand the problems before them and how they might solve those problems. What are some of those bodies of knowledge? Here are some examples. Approaches to framing and procedures for conducting an evaluation, utilization-focused evaluation, participatory evaluation, and so on, responsive evaluation. Another body of knowledge that has to do with ways of understanding and assessing causality. For example, the regulatory view of causality as compared to a realist or process view, the logic of experimentation and its appeal to counterfactual understanding of causality versus a process tracing or outcome mapping methodology. Another body of knowledge has to do with understanding implementation and use of evaluative evidence and social science knowledge more generally. That includes theory of how policy change happens, prospect theory from social psychology, policy windows, agenda setting, coalition theory, equilibrium theory from political science, theory regarding the diffusion of innovation, theory of organizational behavior, frameworks for understanding leadership, and so on. Another body of theory deals with social psychological approaches to understanding individual and group decision-making, an extremely neglected area in the field of evaluation. This includes how we make errors in decision-making, both collectively and individually, how we resist change, and what the requirements for innovation are. Another body of theory deals with theory of change, that in turn can be informed by social behavioral theories as well as systems theory and complexity science for understanding how interventions work in the real world. And finally, there's a whole body of knowledge that we would call methodological theory that helps us understand the different kinds of explanatory programs that are relied upon in evaluation, from standard causal analysis to modeling to narrative accounts and so forth. The activity of problem solving in professional practice is rudderless and unimaginative without these bodies of knowledge. Yet it is also true that without lessons learned from practice, these bodies of knowledge are abstract and empty of any concrete meaning. Theory and practice, or better yet, theoretical and practical knowledge, thus exist in a mutually informing relationship. There are different knowledge interests at work, to be sure, but that does not preclude a productive interaction between the two. To paraphrase a famous saying from Kant, experience without theory is blind, but theory without experience is mere intellectual play. If you need a practical example of what this means, then look no further than my colleague Michael Patton sitting to my left, whose written work on evaluation expertly reflects this blend. So how does all this work in practice? For the past 5 years or so, I've been particularly interested in the problem of knowledge use in policymaking and in decision-making by practitioners. I recently co-authored a National Research Council report on using scientific evidence in policymaking. I've been working with 2 international organizations that are particularly keen on understanding how to better use evaluative evidence and social scientific knowledge in decision-making. And currently, with my colleague Jennifer Green and a number of graduate students, we are conducting a study on the use of data by teacher teams making instructional decisions in the classroom. I am interested in understanding the problem of use as a theoretical problem capable of general explanation and as a practical problem that requires a decision on what should I do now in this situation to enhance use. When I look at the situation of use as a theoretical problem, in other words, from the external third-person point of view, looking in on it, I've examined what the literature has told us about use conceptually, that is, definitions and typologies of use, as well as empirically. What do we know about the effectiveness of various knowledge exchange processes like dissemination and translation and evidence-based practice guidelines and so on? And I'm especially interested in how contextual circumstances of policymaking affect the question of use. Consider, for example, two current policy issues: school reform and immigration legislation. School reform has a deep research tradition. It has unique institutional arrangements, local elected school boards, significant influence of teacher unions, decentralized decisions about curriculum and testing options. It's rooted in an ideology and social political history of local and state control. But policy and law related to immigration is federal. There's very little empirical research bearing on policy options. There is no obvious functional equivalent to teacher unions as stakeholders in policy decisions about immigration. Most everyone has children, but only a few of us actually employ illegals. Not me personally. Some aspects of educational reform lend themselves to experimentation in the field. That's not true in immigration. Thus, the mechanisms of how social science research and evaluative evidence are used, we would expect them to differ substantially in these two fields. And only at the most abstract level, with some benign statement like, you'd better take politics into account when you make policy, would we find any similarities. In the search for, for general theoretical knowledge, my colleagues and I have been pursuing answers to questions such as, what does use actually mean? How are empirical evidence and ideological persuasions combined in arguments for a particular policy option? What do we know about processes of team decision-making, group dynamics, group problem solving, and collective rationality, given that most policy and practice decisions are not made by a single individual, but by a team? Why isn't evaluative and social scientific knowledge used in decision-making at the policy level? How do teachers come to recognize that some information is valuable evidence and regard other information as irrelevant? What role do organizational routines and norms play in the decision to use or not use evaluative evidence and social scientific knowledge? Those are some of the theoretical concerns I have about this problem. On the practical side of making sense of use, on what I would call the first and second person point of view, right, where we are interacting with others, I've been confronted with the need to make decisions in working with evaluation clients. So one client asks me, how much evidence is enough to move from this exploration stage in our grant-making process to deciding which projects to fund? This is a question of what should I do now in this situation facing these circumstances. Another client asks me, how do we put into place a scheme for evaluating excellence in our research projects without that scheme being so expensive or so burdensome or so bureaucratic that we lose the ability to continuously learn from experience? Question for me, what should I do now in this set of circumstances facing this question? In our study of teacher decision-making, if we see teachers acting in ways that are unreasoned in their treatment of data about student performance, should we say something? Should we intervene? That's a practical problem. It demands an action. My answers to these practical problems of use are completely and utterly intertwined with my conceptual knowledge of use. My evaluation imagination depends upon the ability to address those practical problems in view of my inventory of conceptual knowledge. To the extent that that inventory is sparse, my response to practical problems is limited. If I don't act in this way, then I make my decisions in practice only out of habit. At the same time, each time I develop a reasoned response to the question, what should I do, I add to and modify my inventory of conceptual knowledge. Several years ago, a colleague of mine, Bill Sullivan, at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, directed the Foundation's studies of education in the professions, and he used the phrase, a life of the mind for practice. He used it to capture the idea that theory and action, knowing and doing, analytical reasoning and practical reasoning are intertwined. The field of evaluation needs to attend more carefully to how it is preparing evaluators for a life of the mind for evaluation practice. To fail to do so is to risk evaluation becoming the province of technicians. But that's a topic for another day. Thank you.